All right, are you guys ready to try writing it? You can totally do this. So remember, we are going to write our secondary short answers, which is the first question, using Abe as our guide, our famous Abe, okay? My favorite person. So we are going to look at their arguments. We're going to present their argument by giving their answer and their argument. We're going to use the magical word because, and then we're going to further support their argument by giving examples to support their arguments. So let's look at what this would look like. So with our example, the very first place that we're going to look at before we even read our topics is question A, because question A is going to give us some clues. So question A says, briefly describe one major difference between Gallais and Countryman's historical interpretation of the effect of colonization on Native Americans. So we are going to be looking at a difference, and we are going to be looking specifically on the effect of colonization on Native Americans. And remember, we're not reading a textbook. We're not reading that like a set of facts. We're looking at someone's opinion on it. And so we're going to figure out what their opinion is. And then for question B, we're going to look for an example from the time period between 1491 and 1754 that is not explicitly mentioned in the excerpt that could be used to support Gallais. And we're going to look for C for another one that's going to support Countryman's. So now that we know what we're looking for, we're looking at the effect of colonization on Native Americans. Let's go ahead and read their opinions, their arguments. So Gallais says, let's start with Gallais, the story of European colonialism in the Americas and its victimization of Africans and the Indians follows a central paradigm in most textbooks. The African role encompasses the transportation, exploitation, and suffering of many millions in New World slavery, while Indians are described in terms of their succumbing in large numbers to disease, with the survivors facing dispossession of their land. This paradigm, a basic one in the history of colonialism, omits a crucial aspect of the story. The indigenous people of the Americas were enslaved in large numbers. This exclusion distorts not only what happened to American Indians under colonialism, but also points to the need for a reassessment of the foundation and nature of European overseas expansion. So this key right here, he says, look, we have forgotten a key element to this story, that the indigenous people of the Americas were enslaved in large numbers. He's arguing that sometimes we focus a lot on the fact that Africans were brought over, which is true, but because we focus so much on the African role, we forget that Native Americans themselves were also enslaved in large numbers. And so he's saying that's an effect that we need to look at, is that they were enslaved in large numbers. All right, so what's Countryman say? So let's look at Countryman's argument. The 1680 uprising was no isolated event. The 17th century history of modern New Mexico and northern Mexico is punctuated by unrest and rebellion. Many of the region's people had been conquered, and none liked their situation, but they understood that though they were greatly outnumbered the Spaniards, their foes were ruthless, organized, and determined. The Spanish possessed firearms and steel weapons superior to anything the natives could muster. But despite all the odds against successful resistance, Spanish records show instance upon instant of plans and outbreaks among American Indians who supposedly had been, quote, reduced to Christian and Spanish ways. Anytime you see a quote, you always want to pay attention because it might be sarcastically said. And in this case, that's exactly what Countryman is saying. This person is saying, look, the Spanish were powerful, but they continued to resist. They continued to resist and were never succumbed to the Christian and Spanish ways fully. And so Countryman is arguing that the Native Americans' effect was was a resistance. They continually resisted colonial effects upon them. So let's look at, first of all, question A. How can we write question A now that we've looked at their arguments? Well, question A, once again, wants to know what is the difference between their historical interpretation? And you can write this in a variety of ways, but if you're kind of stuck, let me give you a 3-point way to write this paragraph, okay? So all you have to do is you just have to say, okay, what's the difference? What's the first historian's argument and what's the second historian argument? And that could be the layout for question A. But remember, we're giving an argument, and so we need to use these guys right here because we're going to use the example in questions B and C. So you have to state what their argument is and why they think their argument is valid, which is where the word because comes into place. And so in writing our statement, we're basically looking at this. You could write the main difference between Galley and Countryman's argument focused on blank. So what was the difference? Galley argues blank because blank. Countryman argues blank because blank. This is their argument. And this right here is the actual difference that you're giving. And if you write with those 3 components, you are going to write an awesome short answer. So what does this look like? Well, let's take that question and take those 3 components and make it into a full question. The main difference between Galley's and Countryman's arguments focused on how Native Americans were affected by colonization. So there is our difference. Now let's look at Galley. Galley argued one main effect of colonization on Native Americans was the slavery of Native Americans. Remember, we're giving an argument because. Why is slavery a big deal? He argued that comparison with Africans has led many to not understanding the large-scale use of Native Americans as slaves in the Americas. Whereas Countryman focuses more on the effect of colonization as, here's his answer, a persistence of Native Americans to resist colonization because they often fought to keep aspects of their own culture in resistance to European culture. So we cite our difference. For our first historian, we say what their argument is and, using the word because, why they think their argument is true. And you do it the exact same way for the second one. What is their argument? Why is it true? Using the because. And so we have answered and we have explained their argument through the word because. And remember, Abe has an E for an example. And that is because we are going to give our examples through questions B and C. So B and C is in essence looking for those examples. And we can come up with a pretty simple way to write this question. When we write this question, remember we're looking for an example to support their argument. And so realistically, you're giving the example, you're going to restate their argument, and then make the connection between the two. You're just making sure that person can see the connect the dots. All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to use this structure where we give the example by restating the argument and stating what the example actually is. And we're going to then describe it and connect it. Let's see what that would actually look like. So one example that supports Galley's argument, slavery is one of the largest effects on Native Americans. So there's the description, is the encomienda system. So there is our example. The encomienda system allowed Spanish colonizers to enslave Native Americans if they promised to convert them to Christianity. So now let's connect the dots. This supports Galley's argument as it shows the large-scale use of slavery on Native Americans even before African Americans arrived. Let's try this with our second historian. Same structure. We're going to restate the argument. We're going to give the example. We're going to describe the example, and then we're just going to connect it. One example that supports Countryman's argument that Native Americans consistently resisted colonization is the Pueblo Revolt. During the Pueblo Revolt, Native Americans rebelled against Spanish colonizers and rejected their Christianity. This lasted for several years. This illustrates that large groups of Native Americans did not support the cultural changes brought over by the European colonizers. So we restated, gave the answer, we described the example, and we connected the example back to the argument. So in conclusion, as you're writing these short answers, especially when you're comparing a secondary source, I need you to remember one thing. You are writing about a historian's argument/opinion, not a statement. And because it's an opinion, remember that you will be providing the answers. Because it's opinion, they have to explain why their answer is correct. And so you're going to continue that argument with the word because and explain their reasoning. And then you are going to provide examples to support that argument. And so please use the strategy of Abe to guide you as you remind yourself that I am looking at an argument and I must explain that argument and support that argument. If you do that, it'll make your writing so strong and so amazing.